Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me is Sonal Desai, Chief Investment Officer of Franklin Templeton Fixed Income, to discuss the 4 indicators unavailable from government sources of economic data that are important for assessing Americans' ability and willingness to participate in the country's economy as consumers and employees live among the pandemic. Sonal, it's great to see you again. Welcome back to Trade Talks.
Thanks for having me, Jill. So let me just dive right in. What we did with Gallup was around the middle of the year, we launched one of the largest surveys I think that has taken place. In all, we have surveyed around 35,000 Americans to try and understand what is driving the response to the pandemic. To what extent should we be concerned that even if we have an opening up of the economy, for example, are people simply not going to participate? So we looked at several key variables. In particular, we were trying to assess what would encourage people to take part in the economy, to eat out, to travel. What would determine their willingness or openness to in-person schooling? What is the impact if people are not willing to participate in in-person schooling? And what determines everything? Is it demographics? Is it the age? What actually determines people's attitudes? And we had some pretty surprising results, actually. First of all, the most important factor, more than how severe the outbreak is in the area we're in, the demographics of the population, the key factor ended up being the political affiliation of the people who were being polled, which in itself was quite surprising. But beyond that, there was also an amazing level of misinformation. So another factor which is very important is what Gallup's chief economist Jonathan Rothwell and I call the information diet that people absorb in determining how their attitudes evolve with respect to COVID.
Yeah, and it was really interesting going through the survey that the distortion of facts really undermines public health in various ways. And this is what we're seeing play out now. And this has economic costs that are associated with distorted policy references.
And in fact, that's exactly right. It's one of the most worrying things. In a sense, political affiliation and how people absorb information is absolutely key. And here what we found was that on the one hand, while Republicans are far more likely to underestimate the dangers associated with COVID, in the sense that they would underestimate how dangerous COVID is relative to, for example, influenza or car accidents. On the other hand, and by even a greater margin, Democrats were vastly more likely to overestimate the dangers related to COVID. To give you just a brief example, it would be, for example, I think very enormously, by an overwhelming majority, Democrats believed that almost a third of the people who have succumbed and have become victims to COVID in the sense of dying were aged below the age of 44. The actual number is less than 3%. So that is a 10 times overestimation, which obviously has an impact on their desire and ability to go out and participate in the economy. So that is one element. There are other elements. For example, in-person schooling is one of the most dramatic. We conducted experiments where people were given information. They were given information. For example, the American Association of Pediatrics has very short bullet point information on dangers to children with respect to in-person schooling. And we found, and they in fact advise, they are in favor of in-person schooling. We found that the more sensational the news was, which people were given, so some people were just given, the current incredibly high case count, record high case count, for example. Other people were given the information from the American Association of Pediatrics, and we found as much as a 37-point difference based on whether people got information which was not sensational versus information which was sensational. So that is again an enormous burden on the part of those who supply information on the topic.
Right, and this goes back to what you said before about information diet. The thing, we have so much media coming at us, whether it's traditional, social, or otherwise, and you're able to pick and choose exactly where you want your information coming from. So if you're only getting it from, one either conservative news or more mainstream media news, it's going to skew the way that you think, because you would think we live in two different countries when you read the news sometimes.
It actually is so true. And we found that we characterized this in a sense, we called it numeracy. How are people are not only getting different information, they are interpreting facts in a different way. So what ends up happening is that some of the most basic and early facts which came out about the disease, for example, what I stated earlier, which is that older people with greater comorbidities are much more susceptible than younger, healthier individuals. Even that information is very skewed in terms of how it is absorbed and internalized by the population. We found that the people who absorbed both conservative and liberal media were the most likely to actually come closest to the facts. On either of the other extremes, things start getting very distorted very early. This has real economic consequences. All of this information diet, for example, it has influenced how people feel about in-person schooling. In-person schooling, taking that one step further, we found that adults who had children who were completely in remote learning had a 12 percentage point lower labor participation rate than those who had children who were in in-person learning. So essentially, if parents have kids who are at home, they are less likely to participate in the labor force. They are more likely to be unemployed. This is a big problem.
Yeah, it certainly is a big problem. This is a little bit off topic here, but again, what sells news, right? You hear 99% of the people recover. That's not going to sell news, but those heartbreaking stories that you see will. It's almost like the fire department. You only see the really bad fires on TV, but not the thousands and thousands that they control and save lives with every day.
So Jill, that's so interesting. What you just noted was another, we found, again, this was one of the areas where we did see a political affiliation bias. It was this particular piece of misperception was worse amongst Democrats than Republicans, but the Democrats were more likely to say as many as 50% of people who got COVID were hospitalized. The actual number is probably between 1% to 5%. It is dramatically lower. So I don't want for a moment to downplay how serious the disease is. The only point is the more people have misperceptions about what is actually happening, the more likely it is that we're going to get worse health outcomes and worse economic outcomes, because similarly, Republicans are less likely to social distance or put masks on. And both of these are likely to assist in reducing health risks. On the other hand, Democrats are less likely to undertake in economic actions which are better for the economy, frankly, to have some kind of return to normalcy.
Sonal, before I let you go here, let's talk about vaccinations. There's a lot of back and forth whether people are accepting of getting immunized or not. Did the study show anything about that?
Yeah, they did. So in a very slow way, people are increasing acceptance of vaccines, but it's far too slow. And once again, our studies showed that the more information people had on the efficacy of vaccines, the safety of vaccines, the more likely they are to take acceptance. Once again, information having very real consequences in a forward-looking way to economics and to health. Cannot emphasize enough how important it is for us to get good information out there on all of these factors.
All right, Sonal, appreciate the insight as always. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. Thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.